Welcome, everybody, to Geeks and Gamers and Sports Wars college football predictions moving forward and previewing each of the top 50 teams in the country. Today, we're going to be talking about the Alabama Crimson Tide. You can, of course, get free college football, NFL, and other football sports picks and predictions at sportspicks.locals.com. That's sportspicks.locals.com. where you get free football picks and predictions all year. Now let's turn to the Alabama Crimson Tide. For the last dozen years, the University of Alabama and Nick Saban's program has been the most talented team by recruiting ranking standards, by NFL scout standards, by actual NFL performance standards after they leave Alabama, than any other program in the nation. And this year is no different. However, there are two things that give pause as to whether Alabama will be able to repeat as national champions. First, Alabama loses their star quarterback, loses many of their key star wide receivers, loses their star running back. And while they have always been in a position to simply replace and reload, that kind of transition generally comes with some hiccups. For example, in the last decade of them being the most talented program in the country, that though their season total win over this year is 11.5, and so basically you're betting on whether or not they will go undefeated or not, it has been more uncommon for Alabama to go undefeated than common during the regular season over the past 10 years. That would suggest and recommend an underbet. You add to that the fact that they're replacing so much offensive talent, including their offensive coordinator, and their defense has not really been stellar in almost 4 seasons in Tuscaloosa. Been very good, just not the same elite, stifling, dominating defense it was when Kirby Smart was a defensive coordinator there in Alabama with Nick Saban. And that suggests that maybe despite the fact they are by far the most talented team in the country, though only not by far compared to Georgia, Ohio State, and Clemson, but by far compared to the rest of the nation, and still just at least a notch ahead of any other program in the country, they may not have a perfect season this year. Let's take a look at, even though their quarterback, with his letter of intent and with the new NCAA rules removed and changed by the U.S. Supreme Court ruling last year, has apparently already made $1 million before playing a single down for the University of Alabama. Will that translate to a perfect season? Well, let's go week by week. First, Alabama starts off in Atlanta in a neutral site game against the Miami Hurricanes. And back in the day, Miami could be a major competitive threat and had its own dominant era of the 1980s through the early 90s, which came back once it was off probation in the late 90s and early 2000s. But it's been a while since Miami has been a top 10 team in terms of talent. Now, the Manny Diaz seems to have the team in a better equipped and better shape than they've been in maybe a decade in South Florida and Coral Gables. But there's still no match talent-wise for the University of Alabama. And that is why, most likely, that Vegas has Alabama as about an 18-point favorite against Miami at this neutral site opening game. We as well at sportspicks.locals.com predict an Alabama victory in the first week of the season. Up next is Mercer. The only question is whether Alabama covers, not whether Alabama wins. Another win for Alabama. Then Alabama goes to Florida. And this could be a tricky game. This is for Nick Saban in Alabama. The Swamp, I'm sure, will be ready to drain all the energy out of the Tide. But this is a Gator team that has to replace so much star offensive talent, and they have not been in a replace and reload mode like Alabama has for the last decade. The talent differential, again, substantially favors Alabama, so much so that they are likely to be double-digit favorites even in the Swamp. But anything can happen, and Dan Mullen has pulled more than his fair share of upsets in the past. But at sportspicks.locals.com, we again predict an Alabama win. Up next is at home against Southern Miss, which hasn't been competitive really maybe since the Brett Favre days, but definitely not in recent days. An easy win for Alabama. Alabama then catches Lane Kiffin and Ole Miss. Ole Miss looks to be an overrated team this year. The history of Lane Kiffin at major college football programs is a losing record against the spread, despite the fact he deliberately tries to run up scores to cover the spread. And this Ole Miss team, while having a fun, creative, and talented offense, is still a mostly talentless defense. And while they had some fun with Alabama's shaky defense last year, Alabama still, in the end, won by a solid margin. In this game, Ole Miss comes to Tuscaloosa, and we don't see it being close or competitive at all. Another win for Alabama. Up next, Alabama travels to Texas A&M. And this is part of the schedule issues for Alabama this year. They catch some of their more talented foes on the road. So they got to go down to Aggie Land and see whether they can beat the 12th man and prevail against A&M. They do again have the talent edge. Alabama would be favored to win, but Jimbo Fisher has the best spread record of any college football coach in the SEC who's been there for 3 years or more, and probably for good cause. And this too is a very talented A&M team, even though it's replacing their long-standing quarterback. Enough to give Alabama a scare. If Alabama is to lose a game this season, the most likely one in the regular season is this game at A&M. However, we still predict that Alabama will prevail. Up next, Alabama has to travel to Mississippi State in what could be a trap game, depending on how well Nick Saban handles the second year of Mike Leach's air raid. Leach has had a history of pulling off these kind of upsets in the past, though it's still Alabama will be the strong favorite. But coming right off the game at A&M may be the kind of trap game that could pull off a shocker there in Starkville, much as Mike Leach did last season to start the season at defending national champion LSU. We would still favor Alabama to win the game, but an upset would not be completely shocking. Then Alabama gets Tennessee at home, the third Saturday in October, or close there too, with its annual tradition. And Tennessee simply has nowhere near the talent to compete with Alabama at this stage. It would take a true mini miracle for Tennessee to pull it off. The only thing that is favoring Tennessee in this game is the schedule, that this will be before the bye for Alabama, that it comes after back-to-back road games against A&M and Mississippi State, and maybe, possibly, they can pull off a shocker, but that would be a true shocker. We favor Alabama to win at home in Tuscaloosa. Then Alabama finally gets its bye, and it could not come at a better time because it gets a week off before facing LSU at home, their most talented foe left on the schedule after Texas A&M and Florida. Although Ed Orgeron has given Alabama some close games in the recent past, including the big upset at Alabama 2 years ago that propelled them to the national championship, Alabama still has a strong talent edge and advantage over LSU, and though LSU pulling off the upset would not at all be a shocker. Of note, it's pretty rare to beat Nick Saban within 2 years of beating him the first time. So it's not an easy, unless you're Steve Spurrier and Nick Saban still can't figure out the Florida offense like the early years at LSU. Or you're facing Johnny Manziel at A&M and you can't quite figure that offense out back-to-back years. Might pull off a win but not cover. But in all likelihood, Alabama wins this game as well. In fact, arguably this game is an easier game for Alabama to win than the road matches at Florida and A&M. Up next is New Mexico State. That game is over in the first 10 minutes. Alabama win. Arkansas travels to Tuscaloosa then for the third back-to-back home game off a bye for Alabama. This part of the schedule was meant for Alabama to roll tide they will over the Suey Pig Arkansas Razorbacks, who are an improving team, but nowhere near able to catch Alabama at the wrong time in this spot. Last but not least, Alabama travels to Auburn, and while Gus Malzahn was a major headache for Nick Saban, covering the spread more often than not and pulling off shocking upset win after shocking upset win after shocking upset win, either as offensive coordinator or head coach on the Plains. This is a new first-year coach with a depleted talent on the roster. This spells blowout all over the place. Alabama is again likely to roll. For that reason, we think the 11.5 total that has been set by Vegas is pretty much on the number. We think Alabama is more likely to win 12 games than lose a game on the schedule. But there is the historical context, the difficulties of the schedule, Texas A&M and Florida on the road, some trap games on the schedule that could be tricky for them, and replacing so many key offensive personnel and a new offensive coordinator that we're not willing to take the over bet or recommend it in this context. So Alabama's national title to lose once again, as it has been for the last decade, but some stars are aligning in ways that suggest it's still more of an odds-on underdog to win the national title and repeat than odds-on favorite to win the national title and repeat. Until next time, remember, like, share, and subscribe, and join Sports Wars now. And if you want more college football picks and predictions for free, you can get them at sportspicks.locals.com.